One of the reasons that I've, for a long time, been quite fascinated with the whole phenomenon of microfinance is that it is actually a practical application of a concept that I am quite familiar with and have written myself about, which is the concept of social capital. A number of students, former and current students of mine in the room have heard me talk about this at different points, but in fact, what microfinance is building on the existing social capital of poor people, a capital that was not recognized by conventional finance and by political authorities and by the elites that run most developing countries. And so I think that actually all of the discussions of how to measure social capital can actually be transferred quite directly into the problem of how you measure the social performance or the social impact of a microfinance program. So let me just talk about that in a little bit more detail. So what social capital is the informal norms and values of cooperation, habits of reciprocity, honesty, the keeping of commitments that allow people to work together for common purposes. You can get people to work together formally using contracts and the legal system. That's how modern economies work. That's why we have expensive lawyers and court systems. But social capital is not about that. Social capital is informal, and it's something that, in a sense, arises simply among friends, or it's a byproduct, I think, of human beings' natural sociability. And it is extremely important, I think, in many social outcomes, because there are many problems of social cooperation that cannot be solved through formal mechanisms, or where the formal mechanisms are simply too expensive. In the economy, if you have people that can informally cooperate with one another, you save on what economists call transaction costs, because all of the formal mechanisms of cooperation, like the contracts and court systems and enforcement mechanisms and so forth, constitute enormous costs of doing business. In a rich society, we are willing to pay those because that's what's necessary to produce a modern economy. But in the context of less developed societies with poor populations, a lot of times those formal mechanisms are prohibitively expensive. I think social capital also has important political ramifications, because you cannot defend your interests in a political system, whether it's on a village level or whether it's in the realm of national politics, unless weak individuals can come together and cooperate and form civic associations or unions or other types of cooperative endeavors. And so for both political and economic reasons, social capital, this informal ability to cooperate, is very important. And there are a lot of famous cases of the value of this. One of the famous ones, if you've ever been on 49th Street in New York City and trying to buy a diamond in the Diamond District, this is all run by a group of Orthodox Jews who live in the same part of Crown Heights, and they're famous for not actually needing receipts when they leave a bag of diamonds worth several $1 million with a friend of theirs. And the reason that they can do this is because they've got social capital. That is to say, they live in a very tightly bonded community, and they know that if one of their members absconds with that bag of diamonds, that community will have, first of all, that person has a name, they know who he is, and they know how to get to him. And so there's real enforcement mechanisms. You'll see where this is leading when we get to microfinance, right? So, so even in a modern, very developed society like the United States, social capital exists, and it is extremely important. There are also some negative forms of social capital. There's negative forms like the mafia, where you have a lot of cooperation, but it's not for very socially productive processes. But there's also areas of the world in which social cooperation, spontaneous social cooperation, is very hard to achieve. There's a perhaps apocryphal story of a mafioso, a mafia boss, who took his 9-year-old son out into the garden one day and told him to stand up on the wall and to jump into his arms and that he'd catch him. And so the boy hesitated. He said, come on, just do it. And so the boy jumped, and the father let him fall on his face and said, now I want to teach you the lesson, never trust anyone, not even your father. And so, there are also norms and lessons that defeat the purpose of cooperation, and there are societies in which the ability to spontaneously cooperate is very weak. Now, if you ask the question, where does social capital come from and how is it generated? There's actually quite a lot of theory behind this. This is actually one of the good areas where you can apply some game theory, because it turns out that the way we generate social capital is basically through repetition. That is to say, if we live in a small community where we know each other and we interact with each other over time, and it turns out that someone routinely cheats or is dishonest or doesn't meet obligations, we tend to shun that person. And conversely, if that person pays their debts, meets their obligations, shows up on time for meetings, we tend to gravitate towards cooperation. And therefore, there is an almost natural, spontaneous generation of social capital that is the product of repeated interaction, but information is absolutely necessary, because if we don't remember who we've interacted with or what their name was or where they live, we cannot make the decision whether to cooperate or not. And this is actually why culture is important and why levels of social capital across societies differ, because culture is a common means of communication. And it's not that in certain societies people tend to cheat each other more, but if you share a common culture, language, if you know facial expressions, if you can read body language, you can decide who is more reliable and who you're going to cooperate with better. And so this is why I think there is a whole realm of social interaction that is absolutely critical for explaining development outcomes in different societies. It can get stronger, it can get weaker, it changes across different societies, and it can be generated and created if you have the right institutional mechanisms. All right, so this is a general description of what social capital is, but as I think you can see, microfinance is absolutely an application of this, because the big problem with finance is that when you're dealing with poor clients, you have a big problem of due diligence.